You're listening to the Blue Angel Phantoms podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Nothhaft, and I interview former Blue Angel pilots and crew. Today, I have a really special guest in Denny Sapp, who was a solo pilot for the Blue Angels back in 1975 and 1976 when the Blues were pretty new to the A4 Skyhawk. Denny's got a lot to share with us in this episode, including his journey to the Navy, his time flying combat missions in Vietnam, which includes over 365 plus missions, his time serving as a test pilot at China Lake, before eventually becoming a Blue Angel pilot, where he invented several new maneuvers that he's going to tell us all about, as well as some other very behind-the-scenes stories. So if you like the Blue Angels and love Blue Angel history, then stick around and please join me in welcoming Denny Sapp to the podcast. Denny Sapp, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I know it's a Super Bowl Sunday, so I appreciate the time you're taking to spend a couple minutes and sharing a little bit about yourself with us.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate your asking me to do this because I think being recorded for posterity is a pretty good move.
Well, hey, I appreciate it. So you live in the Pacific Northwest, is that right? Is that where you grew up as well?
No, we've lived up here in the Seattle area now for about 35 years, but my wife and I were both born and raised in southwest Iowa, small towns. Hers was much smaller than mine, about 50 miles from Omaha, and grew up as a farm kid and lived fairly close to Offutt Air Force Base. So, but yeah, we're Iowa kids.
Did growing up near Offutt Air Force Base, is that what got you into aviation, or did something else inspire your journey into aviation?
Well, it's interesting about the initial start, and thinking about that, because being close to Offutt back in the 50s, when the Cold War was going on hot and heavy, in our little town of 5,000 people, there was they'd put a tower up on top of the hill that was a manned tower. I don't know if it was 24 hours a day or what, but I was probably 8 or 9 years old, I suppose, and my mom was a volunteer to go up on this tower, and it was to be looking for enemy aircraft that were coming in toward Offutt Air Force Base. So every time an airplane went by, she had to record it in a log of what she was seeing. And with Offutt being so close, we watched a lot of bombers and stuff, U.S. bombers obviously coming into Offutt, and then recorded any airline traffic that was going into Omaha, and even little airplanes and stuff. And so I think our blocks of time were like 4 hours a day, and we would do that like once a week. And I went up with there all the time. So I guess that's the first really looking at airplanes, that I had seen. But as time kind of went on, and I think I was a sophomore in high school in the early 60s, there was a TV program on, and it was the Blue Angels. And I would watch that, along with all the Victory at Sea movies and stuff or videos, the shows that were on too, Victory at Sea. But that Blue Angel series that was on, I couldn't wait to get home from school every day. That's the one series that I wanted to see. So it's kind of interesting. As time went on, I made the team, and I got the chance to know a fellow named Duke Vincent, who was actually Duke Ventimiglia. He was on the team back in 60 and 61 when they were actually filming that. And of course, we've seen some of the episodes in the years since, and they're pretty hokey. The Blue Angels fly into town and they thwart a bank robbery or something like that. It's kind of a funny thing, and Duke wasn't very, proud of that. But the flying stuff was just like anything, the flying stuff was really cool. So that's kind of my first introduction to flying. But as a farm kid, I didn't think there was any chance that I was ever going to be a pilot, because I figured, I thought I was going to be a mechanic out of high school. A lot of my buddies were going to the Air Force and the Marine Corps enlisting. Of course, graduated high school in 63. So the draft was there, and, that was something we all had to consider. Vietnam hadn't really started yet. But as time went on, and I didn't want to really go to college. Dad says, yeah, you got to go to college. He only had a 10th grade education, but he was a machinist for Union Carbide. And he was the one that really, he and my mom both encouraged me to go to college. So I went. He thought I should be an engineer, and I ended up kind of becoming a teacher. But anyway, that was where my first interest, I would imagine. I was just like any kid that built a lot of airplane models, and it was a dream that you could have, but no way it was ever going to really happen in my mind.
So once you were in college, I assume you got in touch with a recruiter, and that's how you found your way in the Navy, or did you have a different journey to the Navy?
Well, yeah, kind of a story I won't really get into in any depth, but when I was 20 and I was a sophomore in college and I thought I wanted to be a Marine. I always thought, even out of high school, I wanted to be a Marine, but three of my fraternity brothers were Marine PLCs, that's platoon leader class, and they would go in the summertime, to to Quantico and get their training, and then they were going to be commissioned second lieutenants. Well, I applied for the aviation program. One of those guys had been in aviation, so I applied to the aviation program and was accepted, physically and test wise and everything else. So I was, but they didn't end up taking me. And I won't go into that story about why they didn't take me. But so I waited about a year and a half until I was about to graduate. And my dad knew people at the draft board and said, you're going to get drafted, so you better think about something to do out of college. So I went to the Air Force and went to the Navy and took their tests and their physicals and everything, and was pretty much thinking I was going to go Air Force until I watched a movie, a World War II movie on carrier aviation at the fraternity house one afternoon. Got all pumped up, fired up, and I thought, oh, that's the way to go. I got to land on a carrier. And so I went down that week to Olathe, Kansas, and signed on the dotted line. And the Air Force recruiter called me up a few days later because he thought I was a shoo-in to come to the Air Force, and I told him I had already joined the Navy. But I'm just so grateful that I did that and had that experience. So yeah, that was kind of my inside story of getting to the to the Navy.
And then how did you become, I assume you have to have a college degree to become an officer, is that correct?
Yeah, yes, that's right. And so, like I say, I was graduating with a degree in education. My wife and I, at that point, my future wife and I were dating, and we just thought we were going to be teachers up in Iowa someplace. And until, like I say, I was trying to do something to avoid, getting drafted and going to the Army. So that's why I had to have the degree. And then I didn't even know if I was going to like flying or not. So a few months before I actually signed on with the Navy, I went out and took some little airplane flying lessons just to see whether or not I didn't even know whether I'd like to go in the air. That was the first time I went into the air, and was flying an Aranca Champ off a grass strip. Of course, no radios, no instruments, no nothing, just pretty much seat of the pants flying, and found out that I loved it, and kind of went into that whole thing about most aviators. I think, they realize, if they have that passion and that absolute love for flying, they're going to know it pretty much right off the bat.
So I assume you went to officer candidate school in Pensacola?
Yes, I did. Okay, I went aviation AOCS, and I was in class 0768, which was in March of 68. And it's kind of interesting. As I went down to Pensacola, I had a brand new GTO, just right out of college. So a lot of guys, when they showed up at OCS, had Corvettes or GTOs or whatever. Anyway, I honestly thought when I started through flight training, which, knowing was going to take about probably 2 years to do all of it, pretty much Nixon had promised that the war would be over, by the time I would get my wings. Well, I was a little bit surprised that didn't happen, but went to AOCS in Pensacola, Softly, then Meridian, and then Kingsville, Texas. Got my wings the summer of 69. And then from there to Air Force training, the RAG, out of Jacksonville, Florida, in the fall of 69. And then I already had orders to a squadron, as a matter of fact. When I'd gotten orders to A4s after getting my wings, they actually gave me orders to a West Coast squadron that was deployed, because I said that in my dream sheet that we fill out, that the one thing that I really wanted to do was be able to go to the West Coast. I didn't want to be an East Coast sailor. And so I got orders to the West Coast. Once I got to the RAG in Jacksonville, VA 44, found out they were going to must pump a bunch of us to get us out to the ship early. So I ended up, there were about 5 or 6 of us, ended up joining the Hancock in spring of 69. The spring of 70. We got there right at the end of the 69-70 cruise to be involved in combat ops for that one line period there. So I kind of got my feet, got my toes in the water, just by getting in on a few of those missions there to begin with.
And on that dream sheet you mentioned, was the A4 Skyhawk on that dream sheet? Is that the plane you wanted to get into, or just what you got assigned?
Yeah, coming out of college, I wanted to fly the A4. I used to have a poster in the room in my fraternity house, and it showed an A4 on the catapult, and so I always had my eyes on that. While I was going through flight training, a lot of my peers were all fired up. They wanted to fly the Phantom, and that just I had no desire for that. The real key that I was looking for was that I wanted to fly a single seater. I didn't really care to fly two-seat aircraft. So on my dream sheet, honestly, the first choice had been A7s West Coast, and then A4s West Coast, and then F8s, just so I could be a single seat guy. But I'm so grateful that I got the attack role. I'm grateful I got the A4. I eventually became an A7 pilot too, but I was just glad to have gone that route. The A4 was just an absolutely fantastic airplane, and of course we'll talk about that probably a little bit more when we get into the blue stuff. But
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, the A4 is a light attack aircraft. So in Vietnam, I'm assuming it's made to go short distance and do perhaps bombing and ground runs, but not necessarily made for dogfighting. Is that an accurate description of the A4?
yes, Ryan, that's right. The A4 was really a light attack aircraft, air to mud. The role that we did over there was initially I had 3 tours over there. My first one was a short one, only a couple months long, and then I went back for 2 9-month cruises. And those first 2, the short one and the next long one, were mostly interdiction into Laos, going after trucks that were on the trail, the supplies that were being run from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. And that aircraft, it would carry 6 500-pound bombs on that normal type of missions. When I went back for the third tour, each tour was separated by about 5 months in between on a turnaround. We're based out of Lemoore, California. The ship was out of Alameda, the Hancock was, and the ship actually comprised of 3 A4 squadrons and 2 F8 squadrons, and then the early warning outfit and helicopter. And the A4 guys, we were strictly air to mud, and we didn't carry anything except guns for any kind of air to air if we were ever going to run into that kind of an issue. The fighters on board were the F8s, and of course they carried sidewinders and guns. So now my third tour was the one that got pretty interesting because that was for in 1972, and we took off on that cruise in January of 72. I actually transpaced an A4 over. That's kind of a long story in itself. But once we got in combat in February, the North Vietnamese were making a big push for an invasion in 72, which actually, looking back at history now and everything, it was much bigger than the invasion of Tet in 1968. We always hear about the Tet invasion because we had a lot of troops on the ground over there. And obviously, all the hype talked about that huge invasion. Well, the 72 invasion, which is referred to as the Spring Invasion, Easter Invasion of 1972, started the 30th of March, and it was about 3 times as large as the Tet invasion had been in 68. So up to that point, we'd only been flying with about 2 aircraft carriers off the coast of Vietnam, off Yankee Station. And with that buildup, and with that invasion from the north, now our buildup started, and we didn't send troops back in, but we sent aviation units from Air Force, Navy, Marine Corps to thwart that invasion, because air was what we really need to stop that supplies of both troops and all the ammunition, all the supplies and stuff that was working south. So from between March of 72 and June of 72, it went from 2 aircraft carriers to 6 working in the Gulf of Tonkin. Of course, we were rotating in and out on our line periods. And then they increased, I forget what the whole number was, that they increased the Air Force squadrons that were moving back in, and Marine Corps squadrons that all went back. And now when we started flying those North Vietnam missions in April 72, our particular squadron was VA-55, and we had 6 specially configured aircraft that had just come to us for that cruise that were what we referred to as Iron Hand aircraft, and they were on the same level as the Wild Weasels in the Air Force. We were there strictly for anti-radiation missile shoots to shut down the SAM, the surface to air missile problem we had up in the north. And of course, there are surface to air missile sites all over the place. And the way that mission worked was that during our major alpha strikes, which 25 to 30 airplanes going into a target, there would be 2 to 4 or even 6 of us that were flying these Iron Hand flights that would fly in ahead. We'd detach ahead of the strike group, go in toward wherever the threat was at, wherever the SAM threats were at, and cover the strike force. If SAMs were fired, well, then we fired back at them with our air-to-surface missiles, the Shrike anti-radiation missiles. We'd shoot back at them. And our 6 specially configured aircraft were pretty cool in the fact that once the missile left the aircraft, we still had a radar that could actually detect the emitting site from the ground, where the surface to air missile site was at. So if we didn't see the SAM launch off the launch pad with a big plume of smoke and fire and see the smoke trail coming up at us, we could actually pick it up by radar and then transfer that image from the radar panel up through the gun sight and look down through the gun sight. We could get a pretty good area of where that SAM site was at. Obviously, they're all hidden in the trees. They, camouflaged heavily and stuff like that. But once we had a good idea of where it was, then our weapon of choice to go back in and bomb them was the Rockeye CBUs, cluster bomb units that would cover about the size. Each bomb would cover about the size of a football field. So you lay one of those out, and if there were SAMs either on launchers or in storage or whatever, there was huge secondary explosions from them. So you had a good kill. So that was our mission then in 72. And
as you sit here today, I mean, it's pretty crazy to think about. At some point in your life, you were probably one of a very small population on this earth that's had a missile, or I should say missiles fired at them, and you're here today talking about it. That's pretty crazy to think about, right?
Well, it is. And as I thought about this over the years and stuff, and one of the things that was really kind of fun this past summer, it's been 48 years now since that 1972 period when we flew. Well, we had a squadron party, and there were 16 pilots of us that had flown in 71 and 72 in that squadron. We met here at our house in Gig Harbor, and it was so soothing to be able to actually sit back and talk with each other about what had happened, because we lost some guys, on the ship. They were either shot down, killed, or prisoner of war. And, and so when you did that on a daily basis, often, and most of the time it was twice a day, sometimes 3 times. And to be here now, almost 50 years later, it's just God's grace, the way I look at it.
And I guess it should be noted for the podcast that you received several distinguished flying crosses for that 1972 tour.
Yeah, it's so funny how medals were given out. That first couple of cruises that I was on, you might get a Navy Commendation Medal if something kind of worked right. But by the time we started working back up in North Vietnam again, and particularly in the kind of work I guess we were doing, I don't know, ended up with a couple of distinguished flying crosses, and I had like 39 air medals, of which like 11 of them were for individual action, and then another like 9 Navy Commendation medals with Combat B, and then all the other trinkets that went right along with it. And it was it's just those that kind of the luck of the draw, just where you just happen to be at the wrong time at the right time, or right time at the wrong time, whatever.
And one of the things that really interests me about that time period in aviation history, I guess you could say naval aviation history and Blue Angel history, is that a lot of the Blue Angels that served on the Blue Angels then went back to the fleet and right back into combat. Did you run into any former Blue Angel pilots? I know you're pretty busy in 1972, but for example, did you run into Harley Hall or any of the outgoing members of the Blue Angels while you were out there in 1972?
I did not. I really didn't know anybody at that point. I mean, the blues was just kind of like it was even an afterthought in my head, I guess, because obviously at that point in my career, I thought there was no way I would ever even think about going to the blues, because I thought that was so far out of my head. Now, of course, in the years since, I've met all the guys, that came through. There were a lot of, people that came back, particularly for that 72 cruise when Harley was shot down. He was shot down in 73, obviously, but Ernie Christensen was back over there, Maslowski. I didn't, and specifically to that question, I didn't know anybody at that particular time that had been on the blues.
So after your deployment in 1972, where did you go?
Well, because of my experience with Iron Hand and flying, going after the SAM sites and everything, I was fortunate enough to get orders to China Lake, California, it's a research and development base. And when I checked in and they found out my background and everything, and of course when I was assigned there, I was just going to be a project pilot. And then they found out my background, so I became the anti-radiation project officer. And the cool part about that was that I was, right off the bat, I was assigned the HARM, the high-speed anti-radiation missile, which is being used today. And that was just right at the ground floor of that. And in the 2 years that I was there before I went to the blues, I got to fire the first 11 HARM shots, and those were all off A7. And then working other weapons that were there. So it was all air-to-ground weapons work, new Rockeye, the Walleye. So it was a great experience, and it was just fun flying. I mean, we would fly usually twice a day. I might fly an A7 in the morning and an A4 in the afternoon, and just got all kinds of flight time, and it was just probably the most fun flying. I know it was. It was the most fun flying that I had of my Navy career.
So eventually you had the desire or were encouraged to submit an application for the Blue Angels.
Yeah, the way that kind of came about, okay, I got there, the end of 72, and the Blues were still flying F4s. So 73 comes around, and they've got their F4s out there. And at that point, a friend of mine from the Hancock was Jerry Tucker. We'd been friends since the training command, and we'd been close friends out on Hancock. He was an F8 driver. Well, he'd made the team in 73. And so I thought, well, wow, that's pretty cool. So I watched him, go to the team, thinking that was really a neat thing, but still wasn't thinking anything about it until the F4 accident then in 73, and the guys got killed and stuff. Okay, so, then when they made the decision to go to the A4, select that, well, I kind of got this burr up my bottom, and I thought, hey, this is kind of a cool idea. I know Jerry, and I like the A4, and so I talked to my wife about it, and and asked her what she thought. And I've had this incredibly supportive woman all my life, and she'd said, if that's what you want to do, well, then go for it. So the way I played that one out, I didn't even know if I really wanted to go to the Blues, because I'd looked at the whole thing, back when I had watched them as a student, and then going through training command and everything. I saw them both in F11s and in F4s, and it just looked like it was something that was totally out of my reach. I didn't know. I thought, gosh, maybe they're a bunch of prima donnas, and it just didn't look like anything that I'm a farm kid. I didn't think there was any way that I could even, go along that line, until I'd seen the fact that Jerry had made the team, and I thought he's a regular guy. So I took my first cross country that I took out of China Lake in the spring of 74. The Blues had just gotten their A4s, and they were at winter training, and I decided I'd go down and see them and meet up with Jerry, and tell him that, I was kind of looking at it, and I seeing about making formal application. And as I met the guys, and we went out to dinner at night, and I had that weekend of palling around with them, and I found out, they're just like regular guys. They're just like all the guys that I knew in the fleet. They're really cool. And still didn't really think, they're This is going to be a real art to probably, make application. But and one of the things that I even encourage today, and when I've talked to the active duty naval aviators, I said, one of the best times to get up to meet the team the first time is go to winter training and meet up with them in winter training. Because what I saw there, and I ended up going twice to winter training to be with them to, get my first foot in the door to see what they were all about. They're at their most humble flying experiences because, you're training and, you haven't gotten the hype yet of all the news and the press and all that stuff that goes around with the normal season. So I did that. And then once they started in the season in 74, then of course you're encouraged to go, to other show sites so they get to know you a little bit better and you can see what they do. And so I did that. I went to, I think I went to about 3 or maybe 4 more shows up until about the summer of 74. And one of the things that was really fun about that was that one guy in particular, Bill Hoverstadt, who ended up making the team as a Marine rep, and he and I were both on the team together in 75 and 76. He was an applicant at the same time I was, and he was an instructor down in Beeville, Texas. And we'd call each other up and find out, about going to chase the blues that weekend and go someplace. And so we'd meet up and then we would, do our formal stuff that we had to do with the blues, like going to the briefs and hanging around them a little bit, if there was a dinner or something like that. But we were just kind of there to just have a good time on our own. And we just enjoyed ourselves so much that it turned out to be a fun thing. So, I'm thinking, okay, as an applicant, that's really a cool way to go. I'm really liking this. But that summer, I'd been to the Salt Lake show. Bill and I were both at that Salt Lake show in June or July of 74. And I came home and I told my wife, Ann, I said, that's it. I'm not going to chase the team anymore. I had met all these guys that I'm competing with, and they were superstars. I mean, they're great guys and stuff like that. They're coming out of the F4 community and the A7 community and stuff. And I'm just an A4 guy, that, did what I did that, I didn't think was very significant. And so I quit going to shows at that point because I honestly didn't think I had really a snail's chance in hell of getting picked up.
Wow, that's incredible. So when did you find out you made the team?
Well, it was about a month later, about 5 weeks later, they'd made their selections. And of course, I went through that whole thing, and I don't know if I'm telling stories out of school now or not about what the team's doing now about in the selection process. But I know I've told this story a lot when people ask about what it was like making the team. And I was sitting in my office. I had a desk, projects office there, and when I got a call from Jerry Tucker. And Jerry called and he said, Denny, he says, I thought I'd call and tell you that, that we had selections for the team. And of course, initially my heart started to soar a little bit. And he said, but I just wanted to call you and tell you, well, you didn't make the team this year. We really like you a lot, but, we really think we really want you to apply again next year, come back for, make application for the next year. I said, yeah, okay, fine. Well, I pretty much decided in my head at that point, I wasn't going to make the team anyway. And I was thinking about my career and where I was going with the Navy. I was about ready to get orders and stuff coming up here in the future. And I was thinking about A7s back at Lemoore and, just pressing on my life. And then he started talking about some of the things that I need to work on, you've got some social issues, that you need to work on a little bit. And your flying ability, there's some, you might want, you might want to get a little, do some improvement here and there. And I'm about to just hang up on him because I'm thinking, I'm not going to apply anyway. And then it's the game that they played down there where everybody gets on an extension on the other line and they all pick up the phone. And next thing you hear, the welcome aboard, asshole. And I was absolutely floored. I was shocked. I had a stack of messages that were on my lap when I'd been reading through when Jerry called me. They all fell on the floor. I was just absolutely stunned. And so he gave me a little bit more information, then I hung up. And then I thought about it for about 5 minutes or so, and I thought, he's jerking me around again. I think he's screwing with me. So I called him back up and I said, Jerry, tell me, and of course his call sign was Turkey. I said, Turkey, tell me, what was the real story? Yeah, you made the team. You need to be down here in 30 days. So now I've got an issue because just few days before that, I had bought this old 59 Corvette from a kid over at the hobby shop that was in pieces. And and he told me I had to be in Pensacola in 30 days. So I've got to figure out how I'm going to get this Corvette back in battery, so I can use it, because that's when I'm going to end up driving across country. And my wife likes to tell a story about how the next thing she sees me dragging this car home in parts, and I spent the next 30 days building it back together, or putting it back together to get ready to drive down there. But one of the things that's interesting about the day they called me, that was on a Monday. It was what I remember, maybe Monday or Tuesday. It's when they'd gotten back into Pensacola. Well, I called up everybody on the base there at China Lake, BX5, the Naval Weapons Center, NAF, anybody that's around. I said, I'm having a keg party at my house tonight. So I went home and told my wife. I said, well, we're gonna expect some people by it. So we had a real celebration that evening. It was really fun, because then over the next couple of years, I ended up flying air shows both years at China Lake. So, to go back and show those people that I thought so much of, when I was based there. It was great.
And when they called you to let you know you were going to be on the Blue Angels, did they tell you were going to be a solo pilot, or did you find that out later?
No, I found that right after they made selections and I was going to make the team. I think they were getting ready they were flying the next weekend. They were flying a show down in Miramar. So I went down to Miramar to be with them, and had dinner with them. And the way I found out, we were eating this really fancy restaurant, and I was sitting next to Vance, and Vance says, "Oh, by the way, you're going to be my opposing solo pilot." And I'm going, "Oh, wow." I mean, because when I was first selected, I thought, I don't have a clue what they're going to do with me. In fact, I didn't know. I really hadn't paid that much attention to what the whole situation was about being a diamond pilot, solo pilot, the narrator, whatever. The whole thing was thinking about making the team. So then that's how it worked out. Vance told me that, yeah, hey, I'm gonna be working with him.
And that's Vance Parker you're talking about. So you go down to Pensacola. How does training start? Do you get a ride in the back seat, or do they just get you up flying right away?
No, since I came into I was the first fleet junior officer, I guess, to come in to the Blues that had been an A4 pilot, and so I was current in the A4. The leaders before me, like Tony Les, obviously he'd been an A4 pilot before he went to A7s and then came to the Blues as a boss. In my case, they just gave me an airplane and somebody chased me, and they just knew I didn't get into the T at all that I remember. And I was looking at my logbook, and so being able to fly, and Bill Overstock came in the same way. He was already A4 qualified when he came to Bayville. So the two of us got to fly the spare. I think we swapped off maybe, or in any case, there was about 3 or 4 more weekends worth of air shows when we got there in October. And so in October and November, I was flying their spare airplanes I know we went to Jacksonville and Key West and New Orleans and stuff like that. So I started flying immediately, but not any kind of training, because maybe you've heard from others too that listen to this sort of thing. When we're selected to the team and you come in, you don't wear a blue suit until you're ready to actually get on the team, until your team is going to be announced at the end of the season. So I would wear just my normal khaki uniform to the show sites and stand in the background. We weren't introduced; we were just there as observers, and so we just kind of hung around and watched what was going on. Now at this point too, they started having us go to the debrief also. So we'd go to the brief, watch the show, do the debrief. And then, the whole idea was to be able to think about, okay, what's your position going to be? So, I'm paying a lot of attention to Vance, because he's finishing up his 1974 season as number 6. And I'm watching what he's doing and knowing that that's what I'm going to have to be doing. And I swear, I looked at it and I kept thinking, am I really capable of doing this? It's like when you go to the carrier the first time and you're flying overhead at 10,000 feet and you're looking down that little postage stamp and you're saying to yourself, am I capable of being able to do this? And so I had a lot of doubt in my mind as to, if it was going to really work.
And speaking of which, so then you go out to El Centro, and that's when the real work starts. How was your first winter training?
Well, even before winter training, once the season ended in November, I looked at my logbook to just kind of clarify where it was at. We were flying once and twice a day through December, all the way up to like December 23rd. I had in my logbook, and Vance at that point was my leader, and we would started initial solo training running the beach, 20 miles or so to the west of Pensacola. We had a stretch of beach down there that we could operate off of. And it all started with timing. And that was probably the biggest crux of what we had to do. You know, obviously the formation guys had to learn how to fly good, solid, tight formation. For the solos, it was being able to get timing down. You wanted to be able to, and when you think about a show site and how it works, a center point is set up, and then there's a film crew at the center point all the time. And you have a checkpoint at either side of center point, and hopefully that center point is going to be on a flight line of some sort, like maybe a runway would even be the best. Sometimes that doesn't work. If it was over water sites or something like that, they might have a couple of boats out there and you'd line those up, but you had a line that you used. And so that center point was critical in that all our maneuvers in 75, 76, and I'm not sure what the day's like or anything, but for the solos, we had to be at that center point at 400 knots on a nose-to-nose hit for whatever the maneuver was going to be. So timing was critical. We started the timing from back behind the crowd at some point. Lead solo's job would be to start the clock and say, okay, stand by, mark. And when he said mark, we both started our clocks. And at 30 seconds past that mark, we needed to be 2 miles from center point at 100 feet and 400 knots. And so the whole thing with the running the flight line for timing was just over and over and over and repetition before we even really started any maneuvers. And then the only other maneuver that I guess that I really started at before I left Pensacola to go to winter training was learning to fly inverted. And I'd flown inverted, you know, on active duty, you know, and when I would just for fun, you know, all of us would go out sometimes and you'd take an airplane and you roll it upside down and just hold one negative G and just try to fly straight level. But the aircraft limitation was only for like 30 seconds. So you didn't do it very long, and you didn't do very much either because the airplanes were filthy and you'd get all this stuff floating, you know, that had been laying at the bottom of the airplane. You roll it upside down. Now it all comes down and lands on the top of the canopy, and you roll it right side up, and it all drops in your lap and stuff. So it's one way to find screws and bolts and stuff like, hopefully not tools. But so I had to learn to fly inverted there on that flight line. And Vance would fly behind me, and he'd say, you know, I'd roll inverted. And the critical part about inverted flight was that you had to be able to roll the aircraft around its axis without displacing left or right. And so if you think about it as an aviator, you know, you want to pull back on the stick just a tiny bit. The A4 had this incredible roll rate, you know, 200 or 720 degrees per second roll rate. So you could snap over in inverted position just immediately. But you didn't want to, typically people, when you roll inverted, you'll move to the left. If you're rolling left, you're going to move to the left somewhat. So he was behind me, and we started these maneuvers to begin with at 1,000 feet. And, you know, just trying to get a judge for being able to roll inverted and then stay level. And then over the days, I would move it lower and lower and lower until I probably didn't get down to much more, maybe 300 feet or so above the ground when we were still over the beach in Pensacola before we went to winter training. Then, of course, once we went to winter training, once we got out there in January, now we started to get into serious training twice a day, sometimes 3 times a day, of doing these maneuvers with repetition over and over and over again. You know, honing that skill of being able to roll the aircraft right around its axis to the inverted position, and then whatever other maneuvers you were going to do, which was knife edge, 4-point roll, horizontal rolls, and those were the opposing maneuvers that we would do.
And you're spending a lot of your time with Vance. Do you become closer with Vance than you do the Diamond pilots, or do you all stay pretty close as far as just personal relationships?
The personal relationship, I think, started, you know, obviously at winter training was going to be Vance and I, because we spent all our waking hours together, it seemed like, because once we would do our 2 or 3 flights a day out in the desert, well, then Vance had never played tennis before, and I came in playing tennis, and so every afternoon for 3 to 4 hours, all afternoon, we'd play tennis, and he became just of course, he's an incredible athlete, and he just became this incredible tennis player. And then with the other guys, the Diamond, our relationship was so close there, and also in that, once all our duties were over for the day and we were into playing foursomes on tennis, there was Smoke, John Jahansky, and John Patton, and we would, and then after all the athletic stuff was over, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, well, we'd all as a group go into El Centro. There's just dozens of Mexican restaurants all over. So 6 nights a week, we would go to a Mexican restaurant for dinner, drink a bunch of beers and stuff, then be back at the BOQ about 8 or 9 o'clock and just really sock it in, just whipped from all the exertion of the day. Then the next morning started at 5 a.m. We'd be down for first. The Diamond would do, for 1 week, the Diamond would do the first launch in the morning, which would be like 6 a.m. or something like that. And then solos would brief. And then after the Diamond came back and landed after about an hour and 15-minute flight, then the solos would go out, and Vance and I go out and we'd work the area for an hour and 15 minutes, and then back and land. Then Diamond go back out again while Vance and I are debriefing what we had done earlier. And so that just went on day after day, 13 days in a row. And then we would take one day off, one Sunday off, and just try to get our head straight a little bit, I guess, and have some fun. And then back into it for another solid 13 days. So we did that for about 2.5 months, solid, January, February, March, and then started our first air show.
That 2.5 months, you're away from your wife that whole time?
We are, and that was a tradition that the Blues had, and I guess it started way back when. It was something that, it was really hard to take, I guess, because here we are in the U.S., and, it's one thing when we were gone, either in the Mediterranean or Vietnam or whatever, when we're going on a 9-month cruise, you get used to that. But so, we were separated for that time. And of course, back in those days, it cost a lot of money for phone calls. And I wasn't a very good writer, so I didn't do very good for writing letters and everything. I never did even in cruise. So we didn't get a chance to, see our wives until we got home. And that was tough.
Gotcha. So you finish winter training successfully. You go on to have your first air show. A lot of the Blues I've spoken with said the first air show is the over the field show in El Centro, and to many they said it didn't really count because you flew there so often. And they would say the first real air show was Yuma, Arizona. Is that your account of how your first air show with the Blue Angels went?
Yes, yeah, it did. So my first year when I was number 6, that's the way it was. And so going to that air show was different. I mean, it's what they call a remote show. So we actually took off out of El Centro, flew over to Yuma to fly the show, and then went back and landed back in El Centro. And it gave our ground troops and everything an opportunity to kind of, get their ducks in order too. So yeah, that was it was an experience, just seeing something different, and I don't remember a whole lot about it. I mean, it was still a runway to fly down, so it wasn't anything that was too far out of the ordinary. And then honestly, when you think about the whole, I know one of the thoughts is the big difference between number 5 and 6, because as number 6, I just had to match what number 5 did. So whatever, I was always tagging along with somebody, so like the boss would definitely, number 1, the boss would have difficult, issues, maybe going with a new show site, week after week after week, learning all that. And number 5 does too, and learning the flight line and everything. But as far as number 6, whatever he set, I was there to match. And, so it actually, I don't know, I didn't think it was really all that difficult.
So it's being on easy street if you are the opposing solo in your first year.
It really is. And an issue, I didn't realize how easy it was, I guess, until I got into being lead solo the next year.
I know you said you don't remember much about your first air show. Do you remember your nerves at all? Were you particularly nervous for that Yuma show, or you don't remember?
I don't really remember. I mean, I think I I think probably had nervous about any air show for that matter. And, I think it was like, because you want to do your best, you don't want to step on your foot anywhere along the line. So, everything I was going to be concerned about, I don't remember. I was not nonchalant about it. Let's put it that way.
Well, I mean, one could probably argue, given your previous experience in the Navy, getting missiles shot at you and landing on a carrier at night might make flying an air show much easier.
Well, it really did. And you're right in that thing with the comparison. That goes back to that whole thing when you're in combat and you're getting shot out by missiles or guns or whatever and everything. You see AAA going around your cockpit. Then the next thing, you have to go back out to the ship. And now you get back out to the ship. And so say it's a night landing and it's, 500 foot overcast and it's raining and the seas are really rough and the deck is pitching up and down like crazy. Well, that made the combat stuff look like a piece of cake. So, and I wouldn't say that, doing our air show stuff was a piece of cake at all, but it certainly was not, it didn't have near the chest thumping or the heavy breathing, I guess, to it, the super emotional excitement, I guess, that combat and then landing on carriers was.
As you move through that 1975 season, are there any other shows that stick out in your memory as just being memorable or a fun show site, or you met someone that had an impact on you?
One of my big things in my first year on the team was that I always wanted to meet all the old solo pilots. Where we were flying a show, it was really important for me to get to know those guys. And of course, like I say, I knew Jerry Tucker. I got to know quite a few of the other guys as we hit the different show sites throughout the year. And I always wanted to pick their brain. It was important for me to be able to understand what they had gone through, what they had done. And I remember one guy in particular that I was just scared to death to meet. And he had been a Marine solo pilot back in maybe the early 60s, I guess it was. His fellow's name was John Kretzinger. And of course, he turned out to just be a gem, and just a super guy. You hear stories about people. Lou Chatham, was a guy that I was so grateful to. I had heard about Lou Chatham for years. Vietnam days, he was skipper of a squadron of A7s over on, I believe it was Midway. I can't remember what carrier. He had been a solo pilot back in 63, 64 or something like that. And so he was one that I really, really wanted to meet. Other people that I got to meet, Pappy Boyington, Art Scholl, Bob Hoover, guys that I had incredible respect for as aviators. And then I was really a motorhead as a kid growing up, loved cars, loved to race and all this sort of stuff. So Don Gartlitz was a drag racer, and he was one of the first guys I got a chance to meet. And Johnny Rutherford was an Indy 500 driver. Those were the highlights for actually through both my years in talking to those guys.
Did you have any particular maneuvers that you liked flying more than others?
Well, if you get into the second year, yes, there was. And this is kind of interesting in that for the 76 team, I was going to be number 5, lead solo. Johnny Miller was coming on as the opposing solo. I didn't really know about Johnny that much. I just knew he had this great reputation as an A6 pilot in the fleet and everything. So I picked him to be my opposing solo pilot. Back in those days, the way you picked who was going to be your opposing solo is that how number 6 got selected was that the boss and number 5, the new number 5, would sit down and talk about who number 5 wanted to have as his opposing solo. That's why I'll always be so totally grateful to Vance, because he and the boss Tony Les were the ones that selected me to be number 6 then on that team. And so then now the next year comes along, and so now we've got a new boss, and it's going to be Casey Jones. And same thing, so Johnny was going to be my opposing solo. And I remember going to Casey right at the very beginning of winter training, and I asked him, I said, what do you want to hear from me? What do you want me to do in what I'm doing in my solo maneuvers? Because we operate independently, the Diamond and the Solo, for about a month. And the Diamond goes off and does their own thing for about a month, and the Solos are doing their thing for about a month. And then before we finally start putting it together with the air show and putting Delta maneuvers together, the 6 of us. So, Boss Jones said, he says, I don't want to hear from you. You just go off and do your thing. And he says, I got enough. It was his first year on the team, and so he's got a lot to learn in his own right. So Johnny and I really had a free hand in being able to do whatever we wanted to do. So this kind of went back to what I had started at the end of the season in 75 when I was finished up at number 6. And I would take Johnny out in December of 75 when we were doing the timing maneuvers, getting all set up on the timing maneuvers. Well, I wanted to try some new maneuvers, right? So one of the things that was popular at that, a movie that was popular at that time was The Great Waldo Pepper. And in the movie, he's a 1920s barnstormer, and he does an outside loop. And so I thought, man, that would be really cool to be able to do an outside loop. And so I went off the beach there, and I started at 5,000 feet at the bottom, and I was at 400 knots, and I max power, rolled inverted, and did an outside loop all the way around to the bottom. And it was very uncomfortable in the fact that the A4's got this real long nose on it. And so as you're coming down the backside of that loop and you're coming through 90 degrees straight nose down and you're still continuing to push forward, and of course the ground's starting to go underneath you, and you can't see out over the nose because it's so long, all I'm looking at is straight down. So in order to get the bottom set up, I have to look out of both sides of the cockpit in order to make the bottom. Well, I was gradually coming down so much at 3 negative G's that I couldn't make the bottom right in front of the show, where show center point would be. So I knew that wasn't going to work. So I thought, well, okay, the next bet would be then to try the outside roll. So I wouldn't, the other part, even backing up to all this, I had to check and make sure, first of all, that the A4 could fly inverted for that long. So one way I did it was I took an airplane out at 5,000 feet, went to full power, rolled inverted, and flew for about 3.5 minutes, and the airplane didn't flame out. So I knew it was probably going to, I think the longest maneuver we did were the outside half Cuban 8s, and they were about 90 seconds long to do those. And so I knew that wasn't going to send it. So now I still want to get more inverted maneuvers in, and that's why I really, really enjoyed that kind of stuff. And so I'd start the roll, and it was a barrel roll. It started on the deck, and I used Johnny to be underneath me in a back-to-back formation. So I'm upside down, Johnny's underneath me, and as we start up into the roll, it's only about a 2.5 negative G push up into a barrel roll, but you're over the top at about 2,500 to 3,000 feet at center point, and then you continue pushing down. So when you get to the top of that, of course, I'm right side up, still in negative G, but I'm right side up, and Johnny's underneath me, inverted. Now as I continue to push on down through the inverted position to the bottom, I bottom again, about a half mile or so out in front of the crowd line, because this was angled. Instead of coming straight down the flat line, it was angled from behind the crowd, so where I would bottom out in front of the crowd at some point. And so that was probably, one of the favorite things that I put into the show. So in the first year, one of the things that I used to get scolded for was we'd be on a cross country someplace, going somewhere, and of course, Boss Les was in the lead, flying along at 10,000 feet, and out of boredom, I would just roll upside down, and I learned how to fly inverted formation that way on cross country flights. Of course, Boss would see me out there, and he'd holler, "Denny, get right side up, get back in position," whatever. But I learned that flying upside down in formation was a little bit tricky in the fact that when you think about the stick control, if you're upright in an aircraft and you want to go closer to the airplane that you're flying wing on, you put the stick toward them, right? So it's just pretty simple in that respect. But when you're upside down, when you're inverted and you want to get closer to the airplane you're flying wing on, you have to put the stick away from them. So, you have to think about, well, what am I going to do in extremis if all of a sudden I get excited, and something happens in a hurry, and when I'm flying close formation on somebody, flying in maybe 5 or 6 feet away, I don't want to put the stick in the wrong direction and fly into them. So, but I learned by holding the stick and wings level, putting the stick in the center position, holding the wings level, and then just using the rudder to go in and out, back and forth, moving my nose left and right, would get close my distance to my wingman. So what Johnny and I developed was that he would fly upside down in the lead position as number 6, and then I would fly off his wing, outboard of him, behind him, and then we would approach the air show site, the center point, in that fashion, and then we would do what was called a double tuck over break. And so we would roll 270 degrees back to the upright, rolling to the left. So it was something that that was something I was always really proud of, that maneuver.
Are those still in the demo today, or are they no longer in the demo?
No, the double tuck overs, some teams in the F-18s have been able to do it. And here's the whole key. I'll go back to, I'm going to give credit to Bruce Davey, who brought in the double farble, which is the case where the diamond comes by. The boss is upside down already. I mean, we did that back, in our day, where the boss was upside down and the three wingmen were right side up on his wing. But in '79, when Bruce Davey was going to take over as slot pilot, he was going to move into the slot. He and I were talking, and he wanted to know how I did the inverted formation, because he would like to go inverted in the slot. And so I told him that trick. I said, just roll inverted, keep your wings level, don't even think about stick control, banking. Just use your rudders to go left and right, on center point. So he started that in '79, and the Blues have done that ever since. The F-18s still do that. It's one of my, it is my favorite diamond maneuver, because they're actually upside down. I really like that. But no, as far as the other maneuvers, the F-18, the A's that they've got now did not have the fuel capability, or they had so many limitations to it that they weren't able to have that extended inverted time like we did. Because, I mean, even in, from all the years on, from '63 on, and I'll go back to Lou Chatham again. I want to give him credit for him having learned to do the first outside half Cuban 8 and 3 negative G push out in the F-11. He also did the first dirty roll on takeoff too. So now when it, with what Johnny and I did, we were able to keep those maneuvers in the A4s until they went into the F-18.
Gotcha. And one maneuver that disappeared with the F-18 is that famous delta landing the A4s used to do. Can you talk us through your experience doing a delta landing from a solo's perspective in the A4?
Yeah, it was interesting. First of all, for the takeoffs, for delta takeoffs, we're set up in a figure 4 formation with 6 aircraft on the runway. So that puts everybody's wingtip is going to be cleared of the other for takeoff, with the idea that if anybody aborts, worst case would, of course, be the boss aborting. The rest of us could still get by them, wingtip clearance and get airborne. So on the takeoff roll, the solos are on the outpost. Number 5 is on the left side, number 6 is on the right side. And our tires, for me as number 5, my left main mount would be pretty much right on the white line of a 200-foot wide runway in order to make, wingtip clearance. And so that in itself was pretty interesting. And then for landing, it was just the delta formation, and we just held formation all the way. And it was, for solos or any of us, I guess, in the back row, you've got one eye looking at the boss and one eye looking up ahead, and then one eye looking kind of down at the runway. So you pretty much know when you're going to hit the runway. But there again, with the exception of the slot pilot, touchdown, we had wingtip clearance for the outpost for 5 and 6. So we could get by. We could squeak by. Now, it was going to be much more critical for the slot pilot, because he's in the slot in the number 4 position, and and he does not want to overrun the boss.
That's interesting that you talk about the delta takeoff. I've never seen any footage of a delta takeoff, and I've heard one other, I think Scott Anderson mentioned it to me in passing. When would you guys do a delta takeoff? Obviously not for an air show, right?
No, they were cross countries. And here's a story for you. We're going through Detroit for a refueling stop, and I can't remember the name of the Air Force base that was there. So, and it was my second year on the team. Boss Jones was the leader. So we landed to refuel, and we'd gone into operations. And while we were in ops, getting ready to go, while the airplanes were getting fueled, the field socked in. I mean, it was 0-0. And I can tell this today because I think statute of limitations are all passed and everything, so nobody's in trouble. But so anyway, we're thinking, okay, this stuff is going to burn off. It's not very deep. It's just a heavy ground fog. So we talked to the boss and said, well, let's just go out and man up. And So we manned up and we started up the engines, and then we decided, well, we might as well just taxi out to the end of the runway, because it's still not clearing yet. So we get to the end of the runway, and then boss asks for clearance onto the runway, and we get on the runway in our six ship takeoff position, and and we kept telling the boss, listen, boss, you just play like now. Navy pilots are allowed to take off 00. That's an authority that we have with those gold wings, right? And so we told the boss, listen, you just make your takeoff just like you would normally in 00 conditions, and we'll just be on your wing, so don't think about us. And he's looking at what he can see down the runway, and he says, well, I can see two center line lights in front of me, so I can see the center line pretty much. We decided to make our takeoff. So we take off, and like in 200 feet in the air, we're in the clear. I mean, it was just this basic ground fog like they used to get in Lemoore. So we're airborne and we're climbing out. Don't think anything too much. We don't even think anything more about it, right? Until about a month later, and we're passing back through Detroit again to refuel at that same airbase. And we go in, and the people in operations were just going ballistic. They could not believe it because, what they hear is they hear the engines start up and they hear us taxi out. And then the next thing you hear is this giant roar, and it's still 00 out, and 6 jets are rolling down the runway. We're airborne. It was a fun one.
That sounds like a fun one. I got a question for you. When the Diamond would land in a diamond landing formation, how would the solos land? Would you land separately, or would you land in an echelon formation?
No, we landed together as a section. All our landings, if we had a 200-foot wide runway and we had winds down the runway and not bad weather conditions, all of our landings were going to be in a delta landing, 6-plane landing. But if we were going someplace that had something less, like 150-foot wide runway, well, then we had to land 4 and 2. And so the solos would land as a section. Now, we did fly an air show one time in Fort Collins, and it was a 50-foot wide runway, and it was, I think, 5,000 foot long. So we had to make individual landings there, and actually we had to make individual takeoffs too.
That's outstanding. I wish the Blues would, I guess they're not able to do that in the F-18 Hornets today.
My understanding, and I flew the F-18 too, and here's a story, I think you mentioned Dave Anderson. I was skipper of an A4 squad, or I'm sorry, of an A7 squadron down at Point Magoo. And while I was CO, we transitioned to the F-18. So we got our F-18s down there in 87, and that was the same year that Dave Anderson and the 87 team was getting their F-18s. And so he and I would spend some time on the phone talking about doing maneuvers with the F-18 with what I had and what I was used to doing in the A4. And then then he would transition that over to what he could do with the Blue Jet. One of the things that the F-18 was notorious for at that time was a drag link failure that would cause the nose gear to cock off real fast. In fact, we lost at Point Magoo. We lost one wasn't one of our F-18s, but a sister squadron lost an F-18 there that the guy touched down, and that drag link failure caused his nose to cock to the left and spun him off the side of the runway. He ejected out of it. But for that reason, my understanding is the Blues are not doing a delta or a diamond landing because of that possibility of a failure. Now, who knows with the Super Hornet as they get them? Hopefully, some of those things will be ironed out because it is so impressive. I mean, obviously, we see the diamond takeoffs. It is so impressive to see a diamond landing, or even if they can have the runway that's available to be able to do the delta landing. I'm not sure it's probably the smartest thing to do. I mean, even in the time that we used to do them, because of the fact that it put the slot pilot, in a precarious position. I'm not sure that's really the way to go yet, but that's for them to determine.
Yeah, there's a video floating around there on YouTube of a Hornet diamond landing with the Blue Angels 1998 Miramar, and that I recently came across that, so I'd love it if maybe they could bring that back with the Super Hornets. But anyway, I move on. I had the chance of interviewing your opposing solo, Johnny Miller, several months back, and he talked about how you got him up to speed as transitioning on the team. One of the things he brought up was the fact that you actually handed him a stack of accident reports right when he got there. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember it pretty well because I had spent my year as number 6. One of the reasons I wanted to get to know all the old solo pilots is I wanted to find out the issues that they had to deal with. And what I found out, and at that time it was so, that was not anywhere near public knowledge as to what had happened, with a lot of times accidents would happen that didn't involve the public at all. And so they were, that was something but I was able to ferret out all the accidents that had happened. And the majority of the guys that got killed was number 6, and it happened at winter training. And so as I thought about that, and working up what I was going to do, my biggest fear in taking a guy, through as an opposing solo was, I got to get him through safely. I mean, the responsibility lies on you, as much as it does the individual himself. Now, granted, some of those guys are pure pilot error, stupid stuff, things that happen that gonna cause you to break your jet or whatever. But in order to get through winter training, I figured that was my first step. And so I did. I told Johnny, I said, this is what kills you. These maneuvers are what kill you. And we also had a written document that had been passed down over the years that was how to do the maneuvers. And then it's the whole key of, being able to do them safely 100 out of 100 times and, know you're never going to break an airplane doing it.
Yeah, and the other thing that Johnny brought up to me when I was interviewing him is that the lead solo would typically take the grief from the maintenance team if, say, for example, on takeoff, Johnny was flying too low and had leaves in his landing gear. You're the one that would get in trouble. Is that true?
Well, I remember that situation, and I remember the maintenance officer chewing me out about it, called me up after we'd gotten back at the end of an air show and said I had drugged Johnny down through the trees, and Johnny and I've talked about it. We joked about that because, everybody flies their own airplane. The only time I guess that think about in '82, there was a big accident with the Thunderbirds. The 4 planes were flying out in the desert, and the boss was flying them through a line abreast loop. And you got each of the wingmen are looking 90 degrees out the side of the cockpit. They're looking directly only over at the leader. And they're coming down the backside of that loop. Well, all 4 of them pancaked into the ground, killed all 4 of them. Anytime I flew a maneuver, with anybody, I had one eye on where it was supposed to be looking, like at the boss, and the other eye was at the ground or whatever that I thought might hurt me. And it was like, I'm flying my own airplane. And in that case with Johnny, I was probably coming around low. I mean, we operated low all the time. And if you're on the inside or the low side of trying to join up, and you'll see this in today's air shows with the F-18s, where they're rendezvousing, say, behind the crowd. And now the way they do it, they leave their smoke on so they can let everybody see how these rendezvous go. Because some of the hairiest part of the flying air show business is making the rendezvous, getting joined up again after you've split apart. And so, you just have to know that you have to fly your own airplane too, and realize where the ground is at. So I know Johnny and I joke about that little issue because that can happen. Things happen with the team sometimes. And, we talk about our briefs and debriefs. And I know I was talking with some people recently about how when the 6 of us went into a debrief, and that's why the reason they're closed is that no matter what might have happened during the show and whatever emotions you might have felt because of whatever happened, you got to hash them all out, and you have to walk away from that debrief with everybody feeling okay, at least the point where, you're still not ferreting some kind of anger or angst or something like that with an issue. So sometimes then an after show debrief might take 3 hours, 3.5 hours. I mean, it might take a long time in order to iron out all your feelings and be feeling good about each other again.
We brought up the maintenance team earlier. It's hard to kind of talk about the Blue Angels without mentioning the maintenance team. How important are they to your job as a Blue Angel pilot?
Well, I thought they were just absolutely so critical. I mean, when you think about the fleet, when we were out there doing that, we'd have a plane captain and he'd be in charge of that airplane. But, his experience level might not be all that high. And so, we pre-flight the airplanes, so super thoroughly. I mean, our lives relied, or were in the hands of our crew chiefs. I had 2 outstanding, incredibly great crew chiefs. Dwayne Mudisbaugh, I had both years. Second year, I also had as an alternate, I had a fellow named Bill Rogers. Both those guys passed down. But, I just absolutely thought the world of them. All those troops, they're first class, second class. They're absolutely at the elite of our maintenance community in the Navy. We got to be very, very close. I mean, it's not like, well, granted, in front of official duties, it's like yes sir, no sir, and all that, whatever you had to do. But other than that, you became, a really tight knit group. I mean, they were some of the best friends that I had, I just can't say enough for them. And I tell you where it's interesting about how some of the feelings that you might have. I want to give some kudos back to my first boss, Tony Les, because Boss Les taught me a lot about leadership and about working with men, now with women, but the idea that to develop the respect on both levels. That I have great respect for them, and hopefully they'll have respect for me, and that you can. So I can say I give that to him specifically with the Blues, and then of course there was another individual in there too that goes back to combat days. He actually retired as a 4-star, but the guy I flew my first combat mission on in Vietnam was a fellow named Stan Arthur, and retired as a vice CNO back in I believe it was in the 80s or early 90s, something like that. And I looked at both of those guys as the epitome of leaders, and to be able to work with the troops and have that rapport, as a working team, and not just as a lording leadership or lording a position over the top of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've never heard a bad word about Boss Les. People speak about him in the highest regard. Thinking back now, do you remember your last air show and any emotions there at all with the Blue Angels?
I remember specifically the last air show. And totally embedded in my mind, in the fact that it was, of course, November, late November. We flew a little bit later in the season back in those days than they do now, and so we had to cancel the Saturday show due to bad weather, which was fine with me. That was great to have the day off because I was at the end of my second year and I was ready for the season to be over. That's kind of what I felt, in the last show. And it was somewhat, it was emotional. But I remember getting out of the airplane and my crew chief had to give me a flight jacket to wear because it was so cold. Cold front had come through and we were just like freezing out there, So in Pensacola at 50 degrees and clear skies, it's cold. But no, I was glad to take off the blue suit, and I stayed around for a few more weeks. I think I ended up flying an airplane out to winter training in early January before I had to report to my next duty station, and I just wore my green bag, my green flight suit, and I took off, like an hour or so after the Blues did to fly and I think we were refueling in El Paso or something like that. But I let them fly ahead, land, get refueled, and be gone, and then I just came through with a spare jet. And I just wanted to be, just totally incommunicado. I didn't, I was ready for that part of my life to be over.
And you had a 23-year career in the Navy, so obviously you stayed in after the Blues. Where did life take you? And I know you mentioned the F-18 squadron.
Well, initially after the Blues, I got my career-enhancing billet to be a catapult officer on the USS Eisenhower, which was a pre-commissioning unit coming out of Norfolk. So we went up there for a couple of years. And that was an interesting tour, but I saw where the rest of my career was going to go. I mean, I'd spent too much time on sea duty. I mean, I'd spent too much time on shore duty, and so the Navy was going to get their just due. So I could see coming out of my cat officer billet at on the Eisenhower to go to back to A7s and then continue on doing all that. The real crux, though, two things happened. One was, from the Navy standpoint, was that they were going to send me to Jacksonville, and I really wanted to go back to the West Coast. But the other really critical part, what really hit me the most, was at that point, our daughter was 6 years old, and our son had just been born. And I started looking at that whole thing about sea tours, and I mean, I love the Navy and everything that goes along with that and everything, but it is really, really hard on married life. And so I saw that, and I didn't want to take my family through that. It was more important, in that respect. So I left the Navy. Then after that was coming up on 11 years, but I affiliated with the reserves right away. And I took an airline job on the West Coast flying for Western Airlines, and then affiliated with the reserves out of Point Magoo. And up there, we were able to, I was flying the A7, used to that and everything. And then as I was in that squadron for about 7 years, and during that time that I was in the squadron, as I went, I came out of the Navy as lieutenant commander, and then shortly thereafter in the reserves, I made commander. And then I ended up, screening for XOCO of the squadron. And so I stayed in. And what got really difficult even at that point, and I'm still flying an airline job and trying to do my reserve duty at the same time. Now, we were only living about 20 minutes away from the reserve base, so it made it easy, and well, not easy, but made it convenient to get out to the reserves to go fly a hop. So I got a lot of flight time in. I got a lot of extra carrier landings in because we were doing boat debts all the time with the A7. And then as I was skipper, we were transitioned to the F-18. So that was really kind of a interesting aspect to have gone from flying A4s and then through the A7, which was a fun airplane. I enjoyed that. And then the F-18 at the end. But, people asked me a lot. They said, which did I, like the best? Well, the F-18 was really a fun gee whiz airplane. I mean, with all the switches and controls and everything you could do for whether you're bombing. I went on my first bombing hop in training and had 12 Mark 76s practice bombs on it, and I got 7 bullseyes, and my worst hit was like 60 feet, and the only reason it was bad hit was because I was messing around with the different systems and realized that I was better off to just do a manual type bombing with the F-18. And then the other role was to learn the fighter role. And I don't want to step on any toes here, but I found out, being a fighter guy was really kind of fun, just fun and games, switchology and all that sort of stuff. And then when you get into a real furball, where your guns only, well, the F-18 was a good airplane to fly for that, but it still goes back to the A4 days. The A4 was absolutely the best, and I'd take an A4 and take on anybody,
Yeah. So you had a pretty long career in the Navy, and the Blue Angels is just a 2-year part of that. Where does the Blues really fit into your life? I know there's a saying, once a Blue, always a Blue. How would you describe the impact of being a Blue Angel pilot had on your career and your life?
Well, there's obviously goods and bads on all that. For one thing, on the negative end of it, you've been there, and people expect maybe a lot more out of you, than maybe an average, aviator going, or just a regular fleet aviator going through. Where I found it, difficult was both in the Navy and in the airlines, in that, this guy's flown with the Blues, so they expect you to be the ace of the base. Well, that's not the case. The Blues are just regular pilots. I've always said that probably 95% of the guys who have gold wings out there could be Blues. It's just a matter of training, and train to proficiency, and, you get thrown on the spotlight for, a couple of years, and don't let it go to your head because, you're just a regular person. And, and then from what the experience, though, that I use, because I'm so grateful about having had that opportunity, I've always had an affinity to working with youth and young people. And so, my big thing is always, ever since I left the team, I've been involved with the aviation exploring, with the Boy Scouts, any young people I see in, going around the path, I'm talking to them about, becoming a pilot, becoming an aviator. You thought about the Navy, carrier aviation. And, I can feel proud of the fact that I think I've had some insight for a lot of those individuals to go off to aviation careers. Unfortunately, maybe not enough to the Navy. Seems like maybe I tell too many true stories about what happens in the Navy and carrier aviation and stuff like that, and they end up joining the Air Force.
Do you ever go back and watch the Blue Angels fly today at all?
I do. Well, actually, the only thing that I'm really involved with, and it's our family that's involved with it, that we have been part of for the last 20 years of up here in Seattle. They have Seafair in August. It's the first weekend in August every year. And they're hosted, the Blues are hosted by the Washington Athletic Club, which is a private club downtown Seattle that's a great workout facility. And so they've hosted the Blues for well over 20 years now. So 20 years ago, they started hiring a boat, a big charter boat, to go out on Lake Washington Seattle's kind of one of the premier show sites, I think, for the families, in the fact that Seattle just throws out the red carpet for the families to come on up to be a part of it, to be a family weekend for them. So in this boat that they charter to go out, it holds about 250 people or so. All the wives and family members of the team members that are here go out on that boat. And so for the last 20 years, there's another fellow, Jim Horsley. He was a diamond pilot in 81, and he and I have been narrating that show for these years. Now, the show is, it's not real close to Centerpoint or anything like that, but it's really been the only way that I've had any relatively close association with the Blues, with the exception of maybe every few years, I take a group of kids up to Boeing Field where they operate out of, and we'll do a meet and greet with the team, the current team that comes in within, so these young people can talk to the team like that. And then the only other thing that we've been doing is that every 5 years, when the Blues have their every 5-year reunion, we go to Pensacola and do that. But other than that, that's really about all that we have to do with them.
Well, Denny, I've appreciated your time this day. Is there anything we've left off the table here that you want to mention or talk about, or you think we covered it all today?
There's just so many people that I could talk about and everything, but I appreciate the fact that you're doing this, that you've taken this on as a project. Like I say, I revered your grandfather. I thought Butch Morris was, I'm just so grateful that he put all this together. And I'm thinking about when I was on the team at the 30-year mark, and of course Butch was there for that show. If I ever had a show that I ever was really proud of being able to do, it was the 76th 30th anniversary show at Miramar on a Saturday. It was the bicentennial show that year too. And so probably 80% of ex-Blues were at that show site, And so, over 100 exes were there, plus some of the solo pilots. Well, there was a maneuver that I had put into the middle of that show season that I only did for a couple of months, and then it got stopped. But it was a maneuver that the A4 was so powerful. I wanted people to see all these X's and stuff. I wanted people to see what the A4 could do, because when you think about the basic thrust to weight ratio on the A4 with the load that we had in it for solo flying was better than 1-to-1. So it was kind of like today's thing with the F-18 when you're in burner and you can go to 1-to-1. So, and the maneuver that I did was Johnny and I had developed a maneuver that was called a clean loop, dirty loop. And number 5 always did a dirty loop. This time we incorporated Johnny doing a clean loop, and we would do this we'd hit center point at the same time. And I was going about 175 or so. Johnny'd be going about 450, and we'd pull the nose up, and it was the geometry of how this maneuver went that at 90 degrees nose up, we were matched. Over the top, we were matched. I would be at about 2,500 feet, and Johnny was at about 5,000 feet. And then coming down the backside, 90 degrees nose down, same match. I was slow, he was fast. And as we hit the bottom, and he come blowing by me at about 450 or so, 500, I was slow. But it was the same match. So symmetrically, it was a great looking maneuver from a solo standpoint and aviator standpoint. Well, as I would clear that maneuver, I realized that in order to get my landing gear up, I had to roll the aircraft inverted because there was so much. I was pulling G on the aircraft, positive G, and the landing gear wouldn't suck up. So if I roll inverted, well, the landing gear then came clipped right closed. So I got to thinking. I thought, I think I can do an outside half Cuban 8 on a cleanup on this thing too. So I was able to do it, and the way that it worked is so as I'm hitting the bottom of that dirty loop, while Johnny's coming by me, I'm sucking up the flaps, boards are in at that point. Of course, I've got my gear and my hook down. Now I roll inverted, I'm going about 175 knots. I roll inverted, go to full power, push the nose at about 2 negative Gs through the inverted outside maneuver. Going through 90 degrees nose up, I'm bringing the landing gear closed and the hook up, same time going up. I come up over the top of this thing at about 2,200, 2,400 feet, and I'm only at about 100 knots. I mean, it's just kind of, the airplane at this point is just kind of ballistic. It's 0 G, and it's just ballistic through the sky. I don't want to do anything with the ailerons, don't want to create any kind of drag or wing fall off or anything like that. I'm just letting it go ballistic over the top at about 2,200 feet. The nose is falling through the horizon. Of course, I'm at full power. Now the speed's picking up really fast because that's a clean airplane, with that 1-to-1 thrust weight ratio. And by the time I hit the bottom back in front of the crowd again at 100 feet, I'm at about 500 knots. And it's just, it's an eye-watering maneuver to see. And, for what the aircraft can do. I mean, not that the aircraft was all that tough. I think I'm the only guy that has ever done anything like that in the world anywhere. I actually had to stop doing that maneuver. I'm not going to get into that or anything, but anyway, that, so when you ask about favorite maneuvers, I actually never got a chance to really get into that whole thing. That was one that I did.
I bet a lot of the exes got to talk about that one with you after the show.
Well, that was what was interesting because Vance, he was back at the show site, and he was flying F-14s at that point, and so he got a chance to see it. And Lambert was there, and Turkey wasn't there. Jerry was, I think, at sea. I think at that point, and I don't know. There was. But the solos were the ones that could really appreciate it, the ones that could really understand what that aircraft can do. Wasn't anything that we could do. It's just that the aircraft, the A4 was absolutely the best air show performing aircraft the Navy's ever had. You just couldn't do anything wrong with it. And I won't downgrade the Phantom. I mean, the Phantom was big and noisy, and and so that was impressive in that respect. And then the F-18 is just as, big, noisy, and does some good stuff. But as far as maneuverability goes, and probably, from based on the solo, I'm talking strictly from the solo standpoint, it was the best air show airplane that the Blues have ever had.
Well, Denny, this has been a great conversation. I hope we get to meet in person sometime. I make it out to Pensacola every year lately, so hopefully we can bump into each other real soon.
I hope so, Ryan. Yeah, been a pleasure.
All right, so that wraps up this episode of the Blue Angel Phantoms podcast. Special thanks to Denny Sapp for joining us today. I hope you guys are really enjoying these conversations. I know I am. And if you are enjoying them, do me a favor and make sure you subscribe to the podcast and subscribe to the Blue Angel Phantoms YouTube channel. So until next time, I'll see you real soon.